Naomi Brooks did not move. The silver tray remained balanced against her palm with the same steady discipline she had practiced through thousands of shifts. Crystal flutes reflected the ballroom lights, their delicate rims trembling ever so slightly, not because her hands were shaking, but because the silence around her seemed almost alive. Charlotte Whitmore folded her arms. Well. Her smile never faded. I'm waiting. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances, but no one stepped forward. Years of privilege had taught them that interrupting a wealthy bride on her wedding day was simply something people didn't do, especially not for a waitress. Naomi lowered her eyes, not in surrender, but to the puddle of champagne glistening on the marble floor. She slowly reached toward the pocket of her apron. Instead of kneeling, she unfolded a fresh white polishing cloth. Then she bent only enough to place it gently over the spill before straightening once again. There you go, ma'am. Charlotte blinked. What is this? A clean cloth. I told you to clean it. Yes, ma'am. So do it. Naomi met her eyes for the first time. I will gladly clean the floor. A brief pause. But I won't clean it with my hands. The sentence wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. It drifted across the ballroom like a quiet gust before a storm. Several servers standing near the service entrance froze. One of them, an older bartender named Frank, slowly looked down at his shoes, already sensing trouble. Charlotte tilted her head. You won't. No, ma'am. You think you're too good to follow instructions? No. Naomi's voice remained calm. I simply believe every employee deserves basic dignity. Someone at one of the nearby tables let out an awkward cough. Another guest pretended to study the floral centerpiece. The musicians continued playing, though their rhythm had become uncertain, violin bows moving almost mechanically while every eye drifted toward the confrontation unfolding beside the bridal stage. Charlotte gave a small laugh. It sounded almost sympathetic. Oh, that's adorable. She turned toward the guests. Apparently today's staff comes with speeches. Scattered chuckles answered her. Not because the joke was funny, because laughing was easier than choosing a side. Naomi felt the familiar weight pressing against her chest. She had lived through moments like this before. Not exactly this ballroom, not exactly this bride, but the feeling never changed. When she was 12 years old, she had watched a department store security guard follow her mother through every aisle without saying a word. When she was 16, a customer refused to let Naomi package her groceries because, according to him, someone else would probably do it correctly. During college, a professor once complimented her essay before discovering she had written it. You actually wrote this yourself? The surprise in his voice had hurt more than the question itself. Life had taught Naomi that humiliation rarely arrived screaming. Most of the time, it smiled first. Charlotte took another slow step forward until they stood only inches apart. You know what's funny? Naomi said nothing. I could have you removed from this wedding before dessert. I understand. I could make one phone call and your manager would never hire you again. I understand. You don't seem frightened. Naomi offered the smallest smile. I'm trying very hard not to be angry. For the first time, Charlotte's own smile faltered. Only for a heartbeat. Almost too fast for anyone to notice. Almost. At the edge of the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell had just finished greeting relatives arriving from Boston. He adjusted the sleeve of his tuxedo while thanking another guest for making the trip. Then he heard something unusual. Not shouting. Silence. The kind that gathered when hundreds of people suddenly forgot how to speak. He turned toward the reception floor. What happened? No one answered immediately. One bridesmaid finally leaned closer. The bride's having a disagreement with one of the servers. Ethan frowned. A disagreement? She hesitated. It looks worse than that. Without another word, he started walking. Back near the stage, Charlotte reached for the polishing cloth Naomi had laid over the champagne. With one sharp flick of her designer heel, she kicked it aside. The white fabric slid several feet across the marble before stopping near the polished shoes of a little flower girl, who stared silently at the scene while clutching her bouquet with both hands. Charlotte looked back at Naomi. I didn't ask for a cloth. She pointed directly at the spill once again. I asked you to get on your knees. The words echoed far louder than she intended. Somewhere in the ballroom, a champagne flute slipped from someone's fingers. It struck the marble floor, shattered into dozens of glittering pieces. No one turned to look, because every pair of eyes was fixed on Naomi Brooks, waiting to see whether the black waitress would finally kneel, or whether something far bigger than a spilled drink had just begun. The shattered champagne glass lay scattered across the marble like frozen pieces of ice, each fragment catching the chandelier's golden light before settling into perfect stillness. No one bent down to clean it. No one dared to move. Charlotte Whitmore stood with her chin lifted, one manicured hand resting against her waist as if she had already won. "Well?" she asked again. Naomi Brooks looked at the broken glass instead of the bride. For a brief second, the glittering fragments reminded her of another floor. Not marble. Linoleum. The tiny apartment where she had grown up on Charleston's east side. She could almost smell bleach mixed with old coffee. She was 11 years old again. Her mother, Denise Brooks, wore the same exhausted smile she carried every evening after cleaning offices downtown. One afternoon Naomi had asked why she never answered back when people spoke to her with disrespect. Denise had continued washing dishes before finally saying, "Because anger makes noise. Character makes history." Naomi hadn't understood then. She understood now. Back inside the ballroom she slowly exhaled. "I'm sorry your shoes are wet, ma'am." Charlotte folded her arms. But I won't allow anyone, including myself, to forget that I'm a human being." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Not because it was dramatic, because it was simple. Truth often was. A whisper traveled through the nearest tables. Did she really just say that? She's finished. Someone needs to remove her. Near the service entrance, another waitress quietly wiped tears from the corner of her eye before pretending to organize empty trays. She knew exactly how Naomi felt. Every server did. Most had simply learned to survive by remaining silent. Charlotte let out a slow breath through her nose. "You people always think everything is about respect." Naomi didn't answer. Charlotte continued. "You're here because you're paid to serve." "I am. So serve." "I have been." "No." Charlotte stepped closer. "I mean serve properly." The emphasis on the last word was impossible to miss. Several guests looked down at their tables. Others suddenly found their phones very interesting. No one challenged her. No one defended Naomi. Not yet. Across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell had almost reached the crowd forming near the stage. "What happened?" he asked one of the photographers. The man hesitated. "The bride's upset with the waitress." "Over what?" "I'm honestly not sure anymore." Ethan frowned. From where he stood, he could only see Charlotte's white gown and the backs of dozens of guests surrounding her. Whatever this was, it had become much bigger than spilled champagne. Meanwhile, Naomi noticed something completely unrelated to the argument. Near one of the front tables stood a little flower girl, perhaps 6 years old. The child still held her bouquet but looked terrified. Her lower lip trembled. She wasn't afraid of broken glass. She was afraid of angry adults. Naomi offered her a small smile. "It's okay." The little girl blinked. Then, almost instinctively, she smiled back. Just for a second, Charlotte caught the exchange. "Oh, don't try to play the saint." Naomi turned back. "I'm not. You think smiling at children makes everyone forget you embarrassed me?" "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." Charlotte laughed sharply. No, ma'am. I was trying not to embarrass myself." Another silence. This one even heavier than before. Julian Reeves, the wedding planner, finally hurried toward them, headset pressed against one ear. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was careful. "The ceremony is scheduled to begin." Charlotte didn't even look at him. "It can wait." "The officiant is ready." "It can wait." "The guests." "I said." She raised her voice. "It can wait." Julian stopped speaking immediately. Years of coordinating luxury weddings had taught him when not to interfere. He stepped back. The quartet quietly stopped playing altogether. Without music, the ballroom suddenly felt enormous. Every breath, every shifting footstep, every nervous cough echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Naomi realized something strange. The silence no longer belonged to Charlotte. It belonged to everyone. Because everyone understood this had stopped being about a waitress. It had become a test. Not of Naomi, of every person watching. Would someone finally speak? Or would dignity be sacrificed simply because the woman demanding it wore an expensive wedding dress? At that exact moment, Margaret Caldwell entered through the side doors. Elegant despite her silver hair, she carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who never needed to announce her importance. She had been upstairs preparing a family heirloom for the ceremony. As she stepped into the ballroom, she immediately noticed the crowd gathered near the stage. The music had stopped. No one was eating. No one was talking. She frowned. What on earth? One of the catering managers hurried toward her. Mrs. Caldwell. What happened? The manager lowered his voice. The bride is humiliating one of our waitresses. Margaret's expression changed almost instantly. Not to anger. To disappointment. The kind that arrived long before fury. She looked across the ballroom. Her eyes found Naomi first. Standing quietly. Still holding the silver tray. Still refusing to kneel. Then Margaret's gaze shifted to Charlotte. Something glimmered beneath the bride's veil. A deep blue sapphire resting against white satin. Margaret froze. The color drained from her face. Her heartbeat skipped. Because she had seen that necklace before. Just 3 hours earlier. Locked inside her private dressing suite upstairs. Margaret Caldwell didn't breathe. For one impossible second, the ballroom disappeared. The guests. The flowers. The chandeliers. Everything faded. Behind the deep blue sapphire resting against Charlotte Whitmore's neck. No, that couldn't be right. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the velvet jewelry box she still carried beneath her shawl. Empty. She had opened it upstairs less than 10 minutes ago. The silk lining had been folded neatly. The clasp unbroken. The necklace. Gone. She had assumed one of the staff had moved it while preparing the bridal suite. She hadn't wanted to alarm anyone before the ceremony. Not today. Not on Ethan's wedding day. But now. She was staring directly at it. Across the ballroom, Charlotte noticed Margaret approaching and immediately brightened. There you are. Her voice became sweet again. Almost musical. We've had a tiny misunderstanding with one of the servers. Naomi remained silent. Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes never left the sapphire. It rested against Charlotte's white gown like a drop of midnight trapped beneath crystal. She knew every curve of that necklace. Her late mother had worn it on the day she married. Margaret herself had worn it exactly once, on the night Ethan was born. It had never appeared in magazines. Never been insured publicly. Never loaned to museums. Very few people even knew it existed. She had intended to give it to her future daughter-in-law. After the vows. As a private family blessing. Not before. Certainly not like this. Charlotte smiled. Beautiful, isn't it? Margaret finally looked up. Where did you get that necklace? The question sounded gentle. Almost casual. Charlotte touched the sapphire proudly. Oh, this. Yes. You'll laugh. I might. It was waiting in my dressing room. Margaret's expression remained perfectly still. My dressing room? Charlotte nodded. I assumed it was your wedding gift. A long silence followed. One so complete that even the photographers lowered their cameras. Margaret spoke carefully. I never placed that necklace in your room. Charlotte blinked. I'm sorry. I asked. Margaret repeated. Who gave it to you? Charlotte hesitated for the first time that afternoon. I found it. Found it. It was sitting on a vanity. Inside a private suite. Well. Charlotte laughed. Nervously. No one was there. Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly. And you thought it belonged to you. The bride's smile weakened. I assumed. You assumed. Naomi watched quietly from several feet away. She hadn't intended for any of this. When she noticed the necklace earlier, she had recognized it from a brief conversation with Margaret that afternoon. The older woman had shown her a faded photograph while waiting for tea. My mother wore this, Margaret had said with quiet pride, smiling at the sapphire around the young bride's neck in the picture. Naomi remembered because Margaret hadn't spoken to her like staff. She had spoken to her like another person. That simple kindness had stayed with her. which was why seeing the necklace now had unsettled her immediately. Across the room, Ethan finally reached the gathering. "Mom!" Margaret turned without taking her eyes off Charlotte. "Ethan! What's going on?" No one answered. He looked from Charlotte to Naomi, then back to his mother. Finally his eyes settled on the sapphire. "You gave it to her already?" Margaret answered quietly. "No." His forehead creased. "But I never had the chance." Charlotte quickly stepped forward. "Ethan, this is ridiculous." He looked at her. "Where did you get it?" "I told your mother." "Tell me." "It was upstairs." "In whose room?" Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it again. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. The whispers returned. "I thought it was a gift. I heard it was locked away. Something isn't right." Julian Reeves felt sweat collecting beneath his collar. This wasn't simply an awkward misunderstanding anymore. The timeline no longer made sense. He replayed the afternoon in his mind. The bridal suite, the family lounge, the security team, every schedule, every delivery. Something had happened, something nobody had noticed. Charlotte forced another smile. "Can we please do this after the ceremony?" Margaret answered before Ethan could speak. "No." The single word echoed through the ballroom. Not loud, not angry. Final. Charlotte's shoulders stiffened. "Margaret, my family's heirloom disappeared from a locked room. I didn't steal anything. I didn't say you did. You implied it. I asked a question." Charlotte looked around the room, searching for support. There was none. Not anymore. Because for the first time that afternoon, the room wasn't looking at Naomi Brooks. It was looking at the bride. At the far edge of the ballroom, the little flower girl quietly tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy." He leaned down. "What is it?" The little girl pointed toward Naomi. "The lady with the tray." "Yes." She smiled at me when everyone else looked scary. The father followed his daughter's finger. Naomi still stood exactly where she had been from the beginning. She hadn't interrupted. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't defended herself. She had simply refused to kneel. And somehow, that quiet refusal had changed the direction of the entire wedding. Then, just as the silence threatened to swallow the room once more, one of the hotel's security supervisors hurried through the ballroom doors, his face unusually pale. He walked straight toward Julian Reeves and whispered only 7 words. "There's something you need to see upstairs." Julian's expression drained of color. "What happened?" The guard swallowed hard. The hallway security camera recorded everything. The words settled over Julian Reeves like cold rain. The hallway security camera recorded everything. For a heartbeat he couldn't answer. His earpiece buzzed with frantic voices from the production team. "Julian, we're 5 minutes behind. The officiant is asking whether to begin." Another voice interrupted. "Should we cut the music completely?" Julian didn't respond. His eyes drifted toward Charlotte Whitmore, then toward Naomi Brooks, then finally to Margaret Caldwell. Every instinct he had built over 15 years of planning luxury weddings screamed the same warning. If the footage showed what the security supervisor believed it showed, there would be no ceremony. Not today. The guard leaned closer. "You need to come now." Julian nodded once. "I'll be right back." Charlotte immediately stepped in front of him. "Where are you going?" "Just checking something, Miss Whitmore." "No." Her tone was no longer graceful. "No. One is leaving this room until we finish this ridiculous misunderstanding." Margaret spoke quietly. "Let him go." Charlotte looked toward her future mother-in-law. "Margaret, surely you don't believe," I said. Margaret's voice remained calm. "Let him go." Julian didn't wait for another word. He followed the security supervisor toward the side hallway, disappearing behind heavy oak doors that closed with a muted thud. The ballroom seemed even quieter after they left. Outside the reception hall, the bright elegance of the wedding faded into the practical world of staff corridors. Gray carpeting, service elevators, utility carts. The scent of fresh linen and furniture polish replaced perfume and champagne. The supervisor stopped outside the security office. Inside, 6 surveillance monitors covered an entire wall. One screen displayed the ballroom. Another overlooked the grand staircase. Others monitored loading docks, kitchens, hallways, and private guest suites. A technician paused the recording. There. He pointed toward one monitor. Timestamp. 2:41 p.m. The hallway outside Margaret Caldwell's private suite. Julian leaned closer. The video began. Staff members walked past carrying floral arrangements. Housekeepers pushed laundry carts. Guests wandered toward dressing rooms. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Then Charlotte entered the frame. Alone. She glanced over both shoulders before stopping outside Margaret's suite. Julian frowned. Why is she there? The technician continued playing. Charlotte reached into her bridal bouquet. Not for flowers. For a small silver key. Julian's eyebrows lifted. Where did she get that? The security supervisor shook his head. No idea. Charlotte unlocked the private suite. Slipped inside. Closed the door. The hallway became empty again. Seconds stretched into minutes. Neither man spoke. 3 minutes later. The door opened. Charlotte stepped back into the hallway. Her expression remained perfectly composed. She no longer carried the bouquet. And said, her left hand briefly disappeared beneath the folds of her wedding gown. As though adjusting something hidden. She locked the door. Walked away. Never once looking back. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. Julian stared at the frozen frame. Can we zoom in? The technician enlarged the image. Charlotte's face filled the monitor. No panic. No confusion. No surprise. Only intention. Julian slowly rubbed both hands across his face. My God. The supervisor folded his arms. There's another angle. The second camera overlooked the staircase leading from Margaret's suite toward the bridal dressing room. Charlotte appeared again. This time halfway down the stairs. She paused. Looked around. Then reached beneath the neckline of her gown. For less than 2 seconds, a flash of deep blue sapphire caught the camera before disappearing beneath layers of satin. Julian closed his eyes. He didn't need to see anymore. This footage. It's backed up automatically. It hasn't been edited? No. Anyone else seen it? Just me. Julian exhaled slowly. Keep it that way. Back inside the ballroom, Ethan stood beside his mother. Charlotte attempted another smile, though it no longer reached her eyes. Ethan. He looked at her quietly. I think everyone's overreacting. His voice was gentle. When did you go upstairs after hair and makeup? She blinked. What? My mother asked a simple question. I already answered. No. He shook his head. You didn't. Charlotte folded her arms again. I don't remember every minute of today. Naomi watched without speaking. Something inside her felt unexpectedly heavy. This wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge. It was sadness. She had served hundreds of weddings. She had watched nervous brides cry. Fathers embrace daughters. Children dance barefoot. She believed weddings were supposed to reveal the best in people. Not this. Not humiliation. Not suspicion. The little flower girl quietly walked toward Naomi. No one noticed. She gently slipped her tiny hand into Naomi's. Are you okay? Naomi looked down. The child's eyes were impossibly sincere. She smiled softly. I will be. The girl nodded. My mommy says nice people cry inside first. Naomi felt her throat tighten. Your mommy sounds very wise. The little girl leaned closer. I don't think you did anything wrong. Naomi squeezed her tiny hand gently before letting go. Thank you. Across the ballroom, the heavy oak doors opened once again. Julian Reeves returned. His face had changed. Gone was the polished confidence of the perfect wedding planner. In its place stood a man carrying a truth he wished he had never seen. He walked directly toward Margaret Caldwell. Without saying a word, he handed her a small security tablet. Margaret looked down at the paused image on the screen. Her shoulders slowly fell. She closed her eyes for only a second. When she opened them again, they rested on Charlotte, not with anger, but with heartbreaking certainty. Then she spoke the words that froze every soul in the ballroom. Charlotte. I think this wedding needs to stop. Charlotte. Margaret Caldwell's voice never rose above a calm conversation. I think this wedding needs to stop. The words floated through the ballroom with almost impossible gentleness. Yet they struck harder than any scream. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The guests simply stared. Some still held champagne glasses halfway to their lips. Others remained frozen in their chairs, unable to decide whether they were witnessing a family disagreement or the collapse of a marriage before it had even begun. Charlotte blinked twice. Then she laughed. A short laugh. Sharp. Disbelieving. Margaret. You're joking. No. There are over 300 guests here. I know. The press is outside. I know. My parents are flying in from London. I know. Charlotte's smile slowly disappeared. You can't be serious. Margaret lowered the security tablet into both hands. I wish I weren't. Ethan stepped closer. Mom. She looked at her son. I need you to see something. Without another word, she handed him the tablet. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Ethan looked down. The paused image showed Charlotte standing outside his mother's private suite. Timestamp. 2:41 p.m. He frowned. Julian quietly tapped the screen. The footage began to play. No sound. Only movement. Charlotte walking down the hallway, looking over both shoulders, unlocking a door she should never have entered, disappearing inside. 3 long minutes. Then, emerging again. Calm. Collected. One hand briefly hidden beneath the folds of her wedding gown. The recording ended. Ethan watched it once. Then again. A third time. His jaw tightened. He slowly looked up. Charlotte was already shaking her head. It isn't what it looks like. He spoke quietly. Then tell me what it is. You had a key. I found it. Where? She hesitated. I don't remember. The key. No. Charlotte swallowed. I mean, everything happened so fast. Nothing about the video had happened fast. That was the problem. Every movement had been deliberate, measured, careful. Margaret spoke softly. I've lived long enough to recognize the difference between panic and planning. Charlotte's breathing quickened. I wasn't stealing. No. I was. She searched desperately for an explanation. I wanted to surprise everyone. Silence. Even Charlotte seemed to realize how weak the sentence sounded. Ethan looked back at the tablet. You surprised us. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. Across the ballroom, Naomi stood near the service station with the other waitstaff. Frank quietly whispered beside her. You should probably leave. Naomi looked toward him. Why? This is turning ugly. She glanced across the room. Charlotte's parents had finally pushed through the crowd. Richard Whitmore, tall and impeccably dressed, immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. What happened? Charlotte hurried toward them. Dad. Richard looked from his daughter to the silent guests. Charlotte. She grabbed his arm. They're accusing me. Of what? Taking a necklace. Richard frowned. What necklace? Margaret answered. My mother's. Richard looked genuinely confused. There must be some mistake. I hoped so. Margaret nodded toward Julian. Until we reviewed the cameras. Richard's expression slowly changed. He turned toward his daughter. You were on camera? Charlotte said nothing. Charlotte. Still nothing. The silence itself became an answer. Around the ballroom, whispers spread like wind moving through dry leaves. Did she really? I can't believe. The poor waitress. Several guests now looked toward Naomi. Not with suspicion. With something entirely different. Recognition. For the first time all afternoon, they remembered how this had started. Not with a necklace. With humiliation. Charlotte had demanded that a black waitress kneel on the floor. The room had watched. No one had stopped her. A woman seated near the front table quietly lowered her eyes. She had laughed earlier. Only because everyone else had. Now the memory burned. Nearby, an elderly veteran removed his glasses and sighed deeply. I should have said something. His wife gently squeezed his hand. We both should have. Naomi overheard neither of them. Her attention rested on the little flower girl sitting alone on the edge of the stage. The child looked confused. Not frightened anymore. Simply confused. Naomi walked over carefully. She knelt, not because someone ordered her to, but because the little girl deserved eye contact. Hey! The child looked up. Is the wedding over? Naomi smiled gently. I don't know. Is everybody mad? A little. Are you mad? Naomi considered the question. She could have answered yes. She could have answered no. Instead she chose the truth. I think some people are hurting. The little girl nodded thoughtfully. My grandma says hurting people sometimes hurt other people. Naomi's eyes softened. Your grandma sounds very wise. Before the little girl could answer, another voice interrupted from behind. Miss Brooks. Naomi stood. Margaret Caldwell was looking directly at her. There were tears in the older woman's eyes. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind people fought to hide. I'm afraid, Margaret said carefully, that I owe you an apology. Every conversation inside the ballroom stopped at once. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the black waitress who only minutes earlier had been ordered to kneel. No one moved. No one spoke. They all waited to hear what would happen next. Every conversation inside the ballroom stopped. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward Naomi Brooks. She stood beneath the crystal chandeliers exactly as she had stood all afternoon. Her black server's uniform immaculate despite the spilled champagne, the silver tray resting quietly against her side, her shoulders straight but never rigid. Margaret Caldwell took a slow step forward. The room instinctively parted for her. Not because she demanded it. Because dignity has a way of creating its own space. I'm afraid, Margaret repeated, her voice softer now, that I owe you an apology. Naomi looked at the older woman. You don't have to, ma'am. Yes. Margaret's eyes glistened. I truly do. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Human. I watched someone humiliate you in my family's home. Margaret glanced around the ballroom. And I didn't stop it soon enough. Several guests lowered their heads. The words weren't directed only at Naomi. They were directed at everyone. Naomi offered a gentle smile. Sometimes people need a moment to understand what's happening. Margaret slowly shook her head. No. Her voice carried farther this time. Sometimes we understand immediately. Another pause. We're simply afraid to speak. Those words struck the audience harder than any accusation could have. The elderly veteran near the front table quietly removed his wedding ring for a moment, rubbing the band between his fingers. The woman who had laughed earlier stared silently into her untouched champagne. Even the musicians stood motionless, bows lowered beside their instruments. Margaret turned toward the assembled guests. My father taught me something many years ago. Her voice remained calm. He said, the true measure of a family isn't how it treats its honored guests. She looked toward Naomi. It's how it treats the people serving dinner. No one moved. No one even reached for a glass. The ballroom felt less like a wedding reception now, and more like a room filled with people examining themselves. Charlotte broke the silence. Oh, come on. Her voice cracked with frustration. Are we seriously turning the waitress into the victim? Several heads turned sharply toward her. She noticed it immediately. The room had changed. Only minutes ago, people had laughed with her. Now, no one laughed. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Say something. He didn't. Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi. Not with pity. With shame. I should have walked over sooner. The sentence barely rose above a whisper. Charlotte stared. What? When I heard there was an argument. He swallowed. I assumed it would resolve itself. He looked directly at Naomi. It wasn't your job to defend your dignity alone. Naomi felt something tighten inside her chest. Not because of the apology, because it sounded sincere. She nodded gently. Thank you. Across the ballroom, Frank quietly whispered to another server. I've never seen anything like this. The younger waitress beside him answered softly. Neither have I. She looked toward Naomi with admiration. She never yelled. Frank smiled faintly. She didn't have to. Julian Reeves slowly approached Margaret. I've contacted hotel security. Margaret nodded. No police. Julian blinked. You don't want. No. She interrupted him gently. This is still a family matter. Charlotte immediately seized the opportunity. See. She looked around hopefully. It's over. Margaret turned toward her. No. Charlotte's hopeful expression faded. It isn't. You have the necklace back. Margaret nodded. Yes. So what more do you want? The older woman's answer came without hesitation. The truth. Charlotte folded her arms. I already told you. No. Margaret replied quietly. You told us several different stories. Richard Whitmore stepped beside his daughter. His face looked years older than it had an hour ago. Charlotte. She looked at him. If there's something we don't know. His voice trembled. Tell us now. She looked away. The silence stretched. Richard understood before she spoke. His shoulders slowly slumped. Oh. The single syllable carried more disappointment than anger. You really did. Charlotte's eyes filled for the first time. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Margaret answered softly. Then tell us how it was supposed to happen. Charlotte stared at the marble floor. Her reflection shimmered faintly beneath the chandelier light. When I saw the necklace, she whispered. I thought. No one interrupted. I thought. She struggled to continue. People would finally see me as part of this family. Margaret frowned gently. You believed wearing my mother's necklace would make that happen? Charlotte nodded once. I just wanted to belong. The confession hung heavily in the room. It explained something, but not everything. Ethan looked at her quietly. You could have asked. Charlotte laughed bitterly through forming tears. What if you said no? I wouldn't have. You don't know that. No. He admitted. I don't. He took one slow step closer. But I know something else. Charlotte looked at him. You didn't have to make someone else feel small. His eyes drifted toward Naomi. To make yourself feel important. No one breathed. The sentence settled over the ballroom like falling snow. Simple. Gentle. Impossible to argue with. Naomi looked down at the white polishing cloth still lying where Charlotte had kicked it across the marble floor. Without thinking, she walked over, picked it up carefully, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into her apron pocket. It was such a small gesture. Yet dozens of guests watched it in silence. Because somehow, the woman who had been ordered to kneel was still the only person in the room quietly putting things back in order. Naomi slipped the folded white polishing cloth into her apron pocket, as though it were nothing more than another task completed before the next table. But the simple gesture lingered in the minds of everyone watching. She had picked up the very cloth that had been kicked across the marble floor to humiliate her. Not because anyone ordered her to, because leaving it there would have made someone else clean it later. Kindness, Naomi had learned, wasn't something you practiced only when people deserved it. It was something you chose because of who you were. Across the ballroom, Charlotte watched the quiet act with growing frustration. I don't understand. No one answered. I admitted what happened. Still no one spoke. What else do you people want from me? Margaret Caldwell looked at her with tired eyes. This isn't about punishment. Then what is it about? It's about understanding. Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. Understanding? Yes. Margaret slowly gestured toward Naomi. You never saw her. Charlotte frowned. Of course I saw her. No. Margaret shook her head. You saw a uniform. The sentence settled heavily into the room. You saw someone carrying trays. You saw someone who couldn't answer back. You never stopped to see the woman standing inside the uniform. Charlotte opened her mouth to argue. Nothing came out. Margaret continued quietly. My father owned hotels for 50 years. When I was 16, he made me polish every brass handle in our oldest property. Charlotte blinked. What? He said if I couldn't respect the people who worked for me, I would never deserve to lead them. Richard Whitmore lowered his eyes. He knew Margaret wasn't simply telling a story anymore. She was teaching a lesson. One that many adults in the room suddenly realized they had never learned. Ethan slowly walked toward Naomi. The guests instinctively stepped aside again. When he finally stopped in front of her, neither of them spoke immediately. He noticed the tiny scuff marks on her inexpensive black shoes, the slight redness around her fingers from hours of carrying heavy trays, the fatigue she had hidden behind polite smiles all afternoon, details he should have noticed earlier. My mother is right. Naomi looked at him. I should have come sooner. She answered with the same calm voice she had used from the beginning. We all arrive at understanding in different ways. Ethan gave a faint smile. You're making this easier than I deserve. No. Naomi replied softly. I'm trying to make sure today doesn't become uglier than it already is. Those words reached Charlotte. She stared at Naomi in disbelief. Why? Naomi turned toward her. What? Why are you still protecting everyone? Charlotte's voice cracked. You should hate me. The ballroom fell silent once again. Naomi considered the question carefully, long enough that everyone wondered if this would finally be the moment anger appeared, and said, she slowly shook her head. Hate is expensive. Charlotte frowned. It costs too much. For who? For the person carrying it. The words landed gently, yet somehow they reached farther than any accusation could have. The elderly veteran quietly wiped moisture from one eye. The young waitress standing beside Frank looked down, pretending to adjust her apron so no one would notice her tears. Even Julian Reeves found himself staring at the floor. Naomi continued. My mother used to tell me something after difficult days. Charlotte remained perfectly still. Never let someone else's cruelty decide who you become. A long silence followed. I've spent too many years trying to remember those words. Charlotte whispered. And today? Naomi looked around the magnificent ballroom. At the crystal chandeliers. At the roses. At the guests. At the wedding that had stopped before the vows. I remembered. For the first time since the confrontation began. Charlotte's eyes filled completely. Not with the frustration of being exposed. With something unfamiliar. Embarrassment. Real embarrassment. Richard Whitmore quietly placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. She didn't pull away. You owe her more than an explanation. Charlotte swallowed. I know. You owe her an apology. Charlotte looked toward Naomi. Every instinct inside her resisted. Pride fought desperately against conscience. Her throat tightened. The words refused to come. Meanwhile, the little flower girl wandered back toward Naomi carrying the slightly wilted bouquet she had held all afternoon. One white rose had slipped loose from the ribbon. She held it out with both hands. This one's for you. Naomi blinked. For me. The little girl nodded enthusiastically. Pretty people should have flowers too. A soft laugh escaped somewhere among the guests. Not mocking. Warm. Several people smiled through damp eyes. Naomi accepted the rose carefully, as though it were something priceless. Thank you. The child hugged her waist without another word before skipping back toward her parents. Watching the scene, Margaret felt tears gather once more. No speech. No argument. No courtroom. Just one child who had seen something most adults had missed all afternoon. Who deserved kindness. As Naomi gently held the white rose in one hand, Ethan noticed something tucked beneath the bouquet's ribbon. A small ivory envelope. His expression changed. Wait. He stepped closer. Where did that come from? The little flower girl looked back innocently. It was already tied to the flowers. Ethan carefully removed the envelope. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were only 4 words. For the right bride. The entire ballroom went silent again. The ivory envelope rested quietly in Ethan Caldwell's hands. No logo. No seal. Just 4 words written in elegant black ink. For the right bride. No one spoke. Even Charlotte's breathing seemed to stop. Ethan looked toward his mother. Did you write this? Margaret slowly nodded. Years ago. She reached for the envelope carefully, her fingertips brushing its slightly yellowed edges. I never intended anyone to see it until after the ceremony. The ballroom remained silent as she gently unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thick, cream-colored, etched with age. She smiled sadly. It was written by my mother. Charlotte closed her eyes. Another family heirloom. Another thing she had tried to claim before earning it. Margaret began reading aloud. To the woman who one day joins this family. Her voice trembled slightly. You will not become a Caldwell because of a ring. She paused. Nor because of a wedding. Another pause. Nor because of the wealth you inherit. Several guests lowered their heads. You will become family on the first day you choose kindness over pride. Margaret's voice grew quieter. When you protect those with less power than yourself. She swallowed. And when every person who works in your home leaves believing they were treated with dignity. The final sentence echoed beneath the chandeliers. No one dared interrupt it. Margaret slowly folded the letter. My mother believed character always reveals itself before marriage. Her eyes drifted toward Charlotte. She simply found a gentler way of saying it. Charlotte stared at the marble floor. Tears finally rolled freely down her face. Not dramatic sobs. Not desperate cries. Just silent tears that darkened the satin at her feet. Richard Whitmore quietly stepped away. He knew there was nothing a father could say that would rescue his daughter from the truth. Across the ballroom, Naomi still held the single white rose. She hadn't expected to become part of anyone's family story. She certainly hadn't expected to become part of their greatest lesson. Ethan looked at the letter again. Then toward Naomi. Did you know about this? She shook her head immediately. No, sir. I've never seen it. I believe you. His answer came without hesitation. Charlotte heard those 3 words. I believe you. She realized something painful. Hours earlier, everyone had believed her. Without evidence. Without questions. Naomi had been forced to prove her innocence simply because she wore a server's uniform. Now, the opposite had happened. Trust had shifted. Not because Naomi defended herself. Because she never stopped telling the truth. Charlotte slowly walked toward her. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The ballroom watched. No whispers. No cameras clicking. Only silence. When she finally stood in front of Naomi, she struggled to lift her eyes. The word caught in her throat. She tried again. I'm sorry. Naomi remained quiet. Charlotte continued. I embarrassed you. Another breath. I judged you. Another. I treated you like you mattered less than I did. Her shoulders began to shake. I don't know how to undo that. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she answered honestly. You can't. Charlotte closed her eyes. The truth hurt. But, Naomi continued softly. You can decide who you become after today. Charlotte slowly opened her eyes. Naomi's voice carried no anger. Only sincerity. My mother used to tell me that apologies aren't doors. Charlotte frowned slightly. They're windows. You don't walk through them. You look through them. And then you decide whether you're willing to change what you see. No one in the ballroom moved. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Some moments deserved memory more than pictures. Charlotte wiped her tears with trembling fingers. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. Naomi offered the faintest smile. Neither do I. Charlotte looked confused. We all need grace sometimes. A tear escaped Margaret's eye. Julian quietly removed his headset. The musicians stood silently beside their instruments, each one watching as though witnessing something far more important than the ceremony they had been hired to play. The little flower girl tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. Mommy. Yes, sweetheart. Is this the real wedding now? Her mother looked toward the 2 women standing together beneath the chandeliers. One dressed in white. One dressed in black. One learning humility. One quietly living it. She smiled through tears. I think. She whispered. This is the part they'll remember forever. At that exact moment, Ethan looked down at the engagement ring still resting on Charlotte's finger. Then he lifted his eyes to meet hers. His expression was calm. Not angry. Not cold. Simply certain. There is one question, he said quietly, that I have to ask before anyone decides what happens next. Ethan Caldwell held Charlotte's gaze for several long seconds before speaking again. His voice was steady, almost gentle, yet every word carried the weight of the silence surrounding them. Before I decide whether this ceremony can continue, I need to know something. Charlotte wiped another tear from her cheek. Anything. He nodded slowly. When you looked at Naomi this afternoon, what did you actually see? Charlotte frowned, caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth, searching for an answer that refused to come. Ethan did not interrupt her. He simply waited. Around them, no guest dared whisper. The chandeliers continued to glow warmly above the ballroom, but the celebration that had filled the room only an hour earlier felt impossibly far away. Finally, Charlotte lowered her eyes. I saw someone serving tables. Ethan remained quiet. Someone beneath me. Her voice cracked on the last 3 words. And now? He asked. Charlotte slowly looked toward Naomi. For the first time all afternoon, she truly studied the woman standing before her. She noticed the faint circles beneath Naomi's eyes from long shifts. She noticed the careful way she held the white rose so the petals would not bruise. She noticed the calm expression that had never disappeared, even after being humiliated in front of hundreds of strangers. Charlotte inhaled deeply. Now I see someone much stronger than I am. Another silence settled over the ballroom. Margaret Caldwell closed her eyes briefly, as though silently thanking her own mother for leaving behind wisdom instead of wealth. Ethan looked toward Naomi. Miss Brooks. Naomi met his eyes. Yes, sir. May I ask you something? Of course. If today had gone differently, if no one had discovered the necklace, would you still have remained silent? Naomi thought carefully before answering. I would not have remained silent. Several guests looked surprised. She continued gently. But I would have remained respectful. Ethan nodded slowly. Even after everything that happened? Especially after everything that happened. Frank, standing near the service entrance, quietly smiled to himself. That answer sounded exactly like Naomi. She had always believed that respect lost its value the moment it depended on someone else's behavior. Ethan took another slow breath. Why? Naomi glanced toward the windows where late afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the tall glass, casting long golden reflections across the marble floor. Because dignity is not something another person gives you. Her voice remained calm. It is something you decide not to surrender. The words settled over the guests like a quiet prayer. A woman seated near the back reached for her husband's hand without taking her eyes off Naomi. Another guest discreetly folded the place card in front of him, suddenly embarrassed by how quickly he had judged the waitress earlier. Ethan lowered his head for a moment before looking back at Charlotte. Do you understand what she just said? Charlotte nodded through fresh tears. I think I am finally beginning to. Richard Whitmore stepped beside his daughter once again. His expression was softer now, touched by both sadness and hope. Character cannot be borrowed, sweetheart. Charlotte squeezed her eyes shut. I know. It has to be lived. She nodded again. Across the ballroom, one of the musicians quietly lifted his violin, then stopped. It did not feel right to play yet. This room needed honesty before it needed music. Margaret stepped toward Naomi until they stood only a few feet apart. Miss Brooks, she said softly, my mother always believed that extraordinary people rarely introduced themselves. They revealed themselves when life became difficult. Naomi offered a humble smile. She sounds like a remarkable woman. Margaret smiled back through damp eyes. She would have liked you very much. Naomi lowered her gaze, visibly moved. That is very kind of you to say. Margaret reached into the velvet jewelry box she had carried since leaving her private suite. Resting inside, beneath the sapphire necklace, lay a small silver family pin shaped like an oak leaf. She looked down at it for a long moment before gently closing the lid again. Then she turned toward Ethan. My son, she said quietly, before you make the biggest decision of your life, there is something you deserve to know that I have never told anyone outside this family. The ballroom grew even quieter as Margaret Caldwell rested both hands on the velvet jewelry box. She looked at Ethan with the tenderness only a mother could carry. Your grandmother gave me this necklace on my wedding day, she said softly. But that was not the greatest gift she left me. Ethan listened without speaking. Margaret smiled faintly, remembering a moment decades earlier. When she placed the necklace around my neck, she whispered something I have never forgotten. She said, one day you will discover that the woman worthy of wearing this family name will never ask for it. She will earn it without even trying. Margaret looked toward Naomi. I did not understand those words until today. Charlotte lowered her head even farther. Richard Whitmore gently placed his hand over his daughter's shoulder, But this time he did not try to rescue her from the moment. Some lessons had to be lived alone. Margaret continued. My mother believed that wealth could buy beautiful houses, remarkable celebrations, and priceless jewelry. But she also believed there was one thing money could never purchase. She paused. A generous heart. Several guests quietly nodded. The elderly veteran sitting near the front table removed his glasses once more, wiping them carefully with his handkerchief. Ethan slowly looked around the ballroom. The expensive floral arrangements, the crystal chandeliers, the orchestra waiting in silence, the elaborate wedding cake standing untouched near the dance floor. Hours of planning. Millions of dollars. Yet none of it seemed important anymore. His eyes finally returned to Naomi. She still held the single white rose the little flower girl had given her. One flower. No diamonds. No designer dress. No spotlight. Yet somehow she carried herself with more grace than anyone else in the room. Ethan smiled sadly. Miss Brooks. Naomi looked up. Yes, sir. Would you do me one favor? If I can. He pointed gently toward one of the empty chairs near the front of the ballroom. Please sit down. Naomi blinked in surprise. Sir, I am working. Not for the next few minutes. She hesitated. I should not sit with the guests. Margaret answered before Ethan could. Today you are our guest. Naomi instinctively shook her head. I appreciate your kindness, but I am comfortable standing. Frank quietly smiled from across the room. That answer sounded exactly like Naomi. She never accepted special treatment simply because circumstances changed. Ethan nodded respectfully. Then stand if that is where you are comfortable. Naomi smiled. Thank you. Charlotte watched the exchange through tear-filled eyes. No one was trying to embarrass Naomi. No one was trying to prove a point. They were simply offering her the respect she should have received from the beginning. That realization hurt more deeply than any accusation. Charlotte slowly stepped forward until she stood directly in front of Naomi once again. This time there was no audience in her mind. No social status. No expensive wedding gown. Only two women standing face to face. May I ask you something? Charlotte whispered. Naomi nodded gently. Of course. Charlotte struggled to steady her breathing. When I told you to kneel. She swallowed hard. Why did you refuse so calmly? Naomi looked at the white rose in her hand before answering. Because my mother taught me that the way I see myself must never depend on the way someone else sees me. Charlotte closed her eyes as another tear slipped down her cheek. Naomi continued softly. If I had knelt because I believed I deserved humiliation, I would have carried that feeling long after today ended. She smiled gently. But if I remained standing with kindness in my heart, then no one could take away who I really am. Charlotte whispered almost to herself. I have spent so much of my life trying to look important that I forgot how to become good. Margaret quietly reached for Ethan's hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Now you understand why your grandmother wrote that letter. Ethan nodded. His eyes remained on Charlotte, but his heart had already reached a difficult conclusion. He slowly removed the folded wedding vows from the inside pocket of his jacket, looked at the handwritten pages for one long moment, and then carefully folded them closed again. Ethan Caldwell held the folded wedding vows in both hands for a long moment before slipping them back into the inside pocket of his jacket. The simple gesture spoke louder than any speech. No one in the ballroom mistook its meaning. The officiant quietly lowered his head. The musicians remained still. Even the photographers stopped lifting their cameras. Some moments deserved witnesses instead of photographs. Ethan turned toward Charlotte. His expression held no anger, only clarity. Charlotte, he said softly, when I asked you to marry me, I believed we were building a future together. A future where people would feel safe in our home, respected in our company, welcome at our table. Charlotte nodded through tears, unable to interrupt. Today I learned something neither of us expected to learn. He glanced briefly toward Naomi before looking back at Charlotte. Pressure does not create character. It reveals it. Charlotte closed her eyes. She knew he was right. I wish I could change what happened, she whispered. Ethan answered gently. So do I. A long silence settled over them. Richard Whitmore slowly stepped beside his daughter. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He simply wrapped an arm around her shoulders like the father of a little girl instead of the father of a wealthy bride. Margaret watched quietly, her heart aching for everyone in the room. No mother dreamed of seeing a wedding end this way. Yet she also knew that beginning a marriage without truth would be far more painful than ending one before the vows. Ethan finally spoke the words everyone already felt. "I cannot continue with this ceremony." Charlotte lowered her head. A single tear fell onto the satin of her gown. She did not protest. She did not plead. She simply nodded once. "I understand." The words came almost as a whisper, but they carried something new. Acceptance. Around the ballroom, guests remained respectfully silent. No applause. No gossip. Only quiet compassion for two people whose lives had changed forever in a single afternoon. Charlotte slowly turned toward Naomi once more. "There is one last thing I need to say." Naomi listened patiently. Charlotte drew a slow breath. "I cannot erase what I did to you." Naomi nodded gently. "No. But I promise you this will not be the woman I remain." Naomi looked into her eyes, searching not for perfect words but for sincerity. This time she found it. She smiled softly. Then today was not wasted. Charlotte's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. Richard gently kissed the top of his daughter's head before leading her toward the side exit. As they passed Naomi, Charlotte paused. Without saying another word, she carefully removed the small white bridal gloves from her hands and placed them on a nearby table. It was a quiet reminder to herself that appearances had never been the most important part of the day. Then she walked away beside her father, leaving behind the ballroom, the ceremony, and the version of herself she no longer wished to become. The heavy wooden doors closed softly behind them. No dramatic sound. No final confrontation. Just silence. Ethan remained standing in the center of the ballroom. After several seconds he faced the guests. "To everyone who traveled here today," he said calmly, "thank you for sharing this day with us. I am truly sorry your kindness was met with disappointment. I hope one day you will remember not how this celebration ended, but what it taught us." Several guests quietly nodded. One by one, they began leaving their tables without complaint. The elderly veteran approached Naomi before departing. He smiled warmly. "Young lady," he said, "today you reminded an old man what courage really looks like." Naomi smiled with quiet humility. "Thank you, sir." He tipped his head respectfully before walking away hand in hand with his wife. Within minutes, the magnificent ballroom began to empty. Crystal glasses remained untouched. The orchestra quietly packed their instruments. Staff members carefully gathered linens and flowers. The celebration had ended, but something far more lasting had quietly begun. The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded like the quiet ending of a long day. Staff members folded white tablecloths with careful hands. Florists gathered loose petals from the marble floor. The orchestra carried their instruments toward the loading entrance without playing a final note. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows, painting long golden reflections across the empty dance floor where no first dance would ever happen. Naomi Brooks quietly picked up another silver tray. To everyone else it looked like she had returned to work. In truth, she had never stopped. Frank walked beside her carrying a stack of crystal glasses. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I have worked weddings for 23 years. Naomi looked at him. "That is a long time." He nodded. "I have seen expensive flowers, famous guests, and fireworks over the lake." He laughed softly. "But I have never seen dignity change a room the way you did today." Naomi smiled modestly. "I did not change the room." Frank raised an eyebrow. "No." She carefully placed another glass into its padded case. "People changed themselves. They simply needed a reason to look honestly at who they were." Frank looked at her for a moment before quietly shaking his head with admiration. "Your mother raised you well." Naomi's smile became warmer. She really did. Across the ballroom, Margaret Caldwell approached carrying the velvet jewelry box once more. Ethan walked a few steps behind her. Neither spoke until they reached Naomi. Margaret gently opened the box. The sapphire necklace rested inside exactly where it belonged. Beside it lay the small silver oak leaf pin. Margaret carefully removed the pin and held it in her palm. This belonged to my grandmother, she said softly. She gave it to every woman in our family who reminded her that kindness is stronger than pride. Naomi immediately shook her head. Mrs. Caldwell, I cannot accept something so personal. Margaret smiled. The necklace belongs to my family. She paused before gently extending the silver pin. This belongs to the values that built our family. Naomi hesitated. Ethan spoke quietly. Please. She looked from one face to the other. There was no obligation in their eyes. No attempt to repay her. Only gratitude. Slowly, Naomi accepted the small silver oak leaf with both hands. Thank you. Margaret reached forward and carefully pinned it to the collar of Naomi's black uniform. The tiny piece of silver caught the afternoon light. It was simple, almost unnoticed. Somehow it looked exactly where it belonged. At that moment, the little flower girl ran across the nearly empty ballroom and stopped beside Naomi. Miss Naomi? Naomi knelt so they were eye to eye. Yes. The little girl smiled brightly. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Naomi laughed softly. Be even better than me. The child nodded seriously. I will try. She wrapped her small arms around Naomi's shoulders before skipping back toward her parents. Ethan watched the moment with quiet gratitude. My grandmother was right, he said. Margaret looked at him. About what? Ethan smiled. The right person never asks to be seen. He glanced toward Naomi, who had already picked up another folded napkin from the floor before anyone else noticed it. They simply give everyone else a reason to see. Outside, the evening sun settled low beyond the gardens of Rosemont Estate. Guests drove away carrying a story none of them had expected to witness. Some would remember the canceled wedding. Others would remember the missing necklace. But the ones who truly understood would remember something much simpler. A black waitress was told to kneel. She chose to stand with kindness instead. And in the end, she did not save a wedding. She reminded an entire room what decency looks like.